What began as a routine late-night interview quickly spiraled into one of the most unforgettable live television moments of the year. Sylvester Stallone, a Hollywood legend known for his stoic presence and no-nonsense demeanor, found himself face-to-face with Jimmy Kimmel, a host infamous for pushing boundaries and poking at nerves. But no one in the studio or watching at home could have predicted what would unfold next. What was meant to be a light-hearted segment turned into a dramatic collision of ego, history, and raw emotion. The crowd was silent. Kimmel was shaken. And Stallone? He was just getting started. Make sure to like and subscribe to catch every second of this stunning confrontation. The lights in the studio dimmed, and the familiar theme music echoed as Jimmy Kimmel strutted to center stage with his trademark smirk. The audience erupted with applause, but beneath the surface of his confident stride, there was an air of tension brewing, one even he didn't seem aware of. Tonight's guest was Sylvester Stallone, the living embodiment of cinematic grit, whose legacy had shaped generations. Kimmel was known for his sharp tongue, but was tonight the wrong time to test it? As Stallone entered to thunderous applause, he gave a polite wave and settled into the seat across from Kimmel. At first, the conversation was light. Talk of Stallone's past films, upcoming projects, and the usual banter. But then Jimmy leaned in. His voice lowered slightly and the smile turned just a bit too smug. "Come on, Sly," he said with a chuckle. "You really think anyone took Rocky seriously back then? I mean, it was a boxing movie where you barely won." The crowd gave a cautious laugh. Some clapped, unsure if it was a joke or the beginning of something more. Stallone's jaw tightened, ever so slightly, but his eyes remained steady. Why poke the bear? What did Kimmel hope to gain by mocking a film that inspired millions? Did he think Stallone would roll with it, laugh it off, play the Hollywood game? "Jimmy," Stallone said, voice calm but cutting, "you ever get in a ring? Ever have to write a script by hand because no one believed in you? Ever pour your soul into something and have everyone tell you it's a joke? Until it wins Best Picture?" The studio fell silent. Even Kimmel seemed caught off guard by the shift in tone. This was no longer late-night fluff. It was real. Instead of backing down, Kimmel tried again, fumbling for control. "I mean, sure, it was inspiring, but come on, man. You're not exactly Daniel Day-Lewis." A few nervous chuckles trickled from the audience. But the moment had already changed. The energy shifted. Stallone leaned forward, voice still low but deliberate. "You make a living laughing at people who do the hard things. I lived through rejection, poverty, being told I wasn't good enough for my own screenplay. And yet somehow I made it. Not by mocking, not by hiding behind a desk, but by showing up and fighting." What was this turning into? Was Stallone about to dismantle the entire late-night act in front of millions? The audience wasn't sure whether to applaud or hold their breath. Kimmel blinked, thrown off for perhaps the first time in his career. The usual glib one-liners were gone. The script was no longer his. And that was when Stallone smiled. Not the charming movie star grin, but something quieter, something earned. "You make jokes about heart," he said. "But without it, what are you? Just noise." The crowd erupted, not in laughter but in applause. Something inside the studio had cracked open, and the viewers at home could feel it too. The cheers weren't just for Stallone's words, they were for the truth behind them. For a man who had nothing to prove, but still stood up and said what everyone else was too afraid to. Could Jimmy come back from this? Would he double down, or would he realize he had just poked at something far greater than a movie role? And as the cheers faded and the lights refocused on the stunned host, all eyes were on what would come next. Jimmy Kimmel sat frozen, his signature grin now reduced to a twitch of uncertainty. The audience's applause still echoed in his ears, but not for him. It was Stallone who had just seized the moment, flipping the dynamic in a way no one on that stage or in that studio, had anticipated. The moment was his, and it was not born from aggression or insult. It came from truth. Raw, unapologetic, and deeply felt. The camera lingered on Kimmel's face just a second too long, capturing the rare image of a man who no longer controlled the narrative. Stallone had not raised his voice, but his words had landed harder than any punch he had thrown on screen. What was supposed to be a light jab at a Hollywood icon had turned into a full-on reckoning with legacy, ambition, and the culture of mockery that late-night television had come to represent. Kimmel adjusted in his chair, clearly rattled but trying to regain composure. Okay, he muttered, forcing a chuckle. I guess I hit a nerve there. But the room didn't laugh. Instead, the silence deepened. That defense, minimizing the moment as emotional oversensitivity, only made it worse. Stallone, still calm, folded his hands in his lap, his eyes fixed on Kimmel with an expression that seemed to say, "You do not understand what you just did." "You didn't hit a nerve, Jimmy," Stallone said. "You hit a generation. You made a career." Out of irony, and that's fine. But don't pretend to know what it's like to bleed for something you believe in. That line struck hard. The audience leaned forward, not out of curiosity, but because they were witnessing something rare. A man laying bare the soul of his journey, not for sympathy or applause, but because someone had tried to reduce it to a punchline. Kimmel finally cracked a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Look, I'm just trying to have some fun here. I mean, we all know Rocky's a classic, but can't we laugh about it a little?" Stallone's answer was slower this time, but deliberate. "We can laugh, but not from a place of dismissal. You ever notice people only laugh at the things they're afraid to respect?" That question landed like a stone. The studio was no longer a comedy stage. It had become a courtroom, and Stallone was both witness and judge. The verdict, that sincerity, had been missing for too long, and the audience knew it. Many of them had grown up watching Stallone rise from a struggling actor to a symbol of perseverance. These weren't just roles, Rocky, Rambo, and all the others. They were blueprints for resilience. Kimmel's brand of sarcasm suddenly felt flimsy in contrast. Still, Kimmel wasn't ready to surrender the segment entirely. He sat up straighter and, with a flicker of edge in his voice, said, "So what? You're saying I should stop joking altogether? This is a comedy show, not a therapy session." A beat passed. Then Stallone tilted his head slightly, considering the words before replying. "No, Jimmy. I'm saying that somewhere along the way, you forgot the difference between laughter that lifts people up and laughter that tears them down." That was the moment the room shifted again. The line hit with the kind of precision only years of experience could produce. It wasn't just a clapback, it was a philosophy, and it forced Kimmel, and everyone watching, to reevaluate what kind of humor they consumed and why. The audience applauded again, louder this time, sustained. Some people stood. It was no longer about a movie or a personal insult. It was about the culture itself. About what happens when mockery becomes the default and sincerity becomes the joke. And for the first time in a long time, Jimmy Kimmel was no longer the one asking the questions. As Stallone sat back in his chair, composed and unwavering, Kimmel looked into the camera, visibly shaken but trying to maintain the show's momentum. But how do you transition from a public reckoning to the next comedy bit? How do you follow a moment that exposed so much, so suddenly? He cleared his throat, attempting a pivot. "Well, folks, I guess that's what happens when you get the real Rocky in the building." But even that line rang hollow. The crowd clapped, but this time it was not out of delight. It was out of respect for Stallone and for the truth he had just delivered. And just like that, the power in the room had shifted entirely. Jimmy Kimmel was still behind the desk, but he was no longer in control. The stage lights did little to mask the awkward tension now draped over the studio like a heavy curtain. Jimmy Kimmel, once the unquestioned master of his domain, sat back slightly in his chair, his usually quick mind clearly reaching for solid ground. But the rhythm was gone. The script, if there ever truly was one, had been shattered. Sylvester Stallone remained poised. No smugness, no arrogance, just calm conviction. The audience, once expecting a night of easy laughs and surface-level conversation, had been thrust into something far deeper, something raw and unfiltered. It was no longer about promotion, it was about truth. Then Kimmel made a bold move, perhaps too bold. He leaned forward and asked, with a flicker of defensiveness in his tone, "So are you saying shows like this are the problem? That making people laugh is somehow wrong?" It was a loaded question, one designed to trap, to flip the narrative and put Stallone on the defensive. But the veteran actor didn't flinch. "No," Stallone replied, measured and direct. "I'm saying there's a difference between humor and ridicule. One invites people in. The other pushes people out," the audience murmured. The line cut clean. It was clear Stallone wasn't accusing comedy of being evil. He was accusing it of losing its soul. And he was doing it on the very altar where that soullessness had become routine. Kimmel, sensing the tide slipping further from his grasp, tried once more to regain control. All right," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Maybe I deserved that. Maybe I took the easy route tonight. But hey, I still love Rocky. You're a legend, no doubt." There was a flicker of sincerity in his voice, but it came too late. It sounded like a man trying to apply a bandage to a wound he never thought he would suffer. Stallone nodded, not out of agreement, but acknowledgement. "Appreciate that. But this wasn't about me. It's about what happens when we forget that stories, real stories, carry weight." At that, he turned to the audience. "You all know what I mean. You grew up with these films not because they were perfect, but because they said something. They told you to get back up when life knocks you down, that it's okay to care, that it's okay to fight for what matters." The studio burst into applause again, this time louder, more passionate. And suddenly the viewers at home could feel it too. The audience was no longer clapping for an actor. They were clapping for themselves, for every time they had to rise from something impossible and keep moving forward. And then, in a move no one expected, Stallone stood up from his chair. Not storming off, not angry, just done with what he came to say. The cameras instinctively followed him, unsure what would happen next. Kimmel, stunned, stood as well. "Wait, are you leaving?" Stallone turned back just briefly. "You said it yourself, Jimmy. This isn't therapy, it's a comedy show." And I think the audience got more than enough truth for one night. There was no anger in his voice, just finality. Kimmel reached for something, anything, to reassert control, but he found himself adrift in a space he no longer owned. The show, the stage, even the audience, belonged to Stallone now. As Stallone exited the set, the crowd stood in a spontaneous ovation. People clapped not just for him, but for what he represented. A voice of authenticity in a world that too often rewards mockery. Back at the desk, Jimmy Kimmel stood alone. The lights still burned. The cameras still rolled. But the magic was gone. The moment had passed, and it had not belonged to him. For perhaps the first time in his career, he was not the star of his own show. And somewhere deep in the control room, a producer muttered into a headset, "Just go to commercial." But no commercial could erase what had just happened. The segment that was supposed to be forgettable became unforgettable. The studio went dark for a brief moment as the cameras cut to commercial, but the tension lingered like smoke after a fire. Behind the scenes, producers scrambled, crew members whispered, and Jimmy Kimmel stood off stage, not talking, not joking, just thinking. Back in the dressing room hallway, Stallone moved calmly, brushing off the polite calls of assistants trying to guide him back for a post-show wrap-up. He had said what needed to be said. He didn't need an encore. His silence now spoke louder than any final word could. But what neither man expected was the aftermath. Swift, electric, and completely out of their hands. Clips of the confrontation were already spreading across social media. Raw footage, unedited and untouched, was shared by audience members who had recorded it on their phones. Within minutes, hashtags exploded. Viewers at home watched in real time as the exchange transformed from an awkward interview to a cultural flashpoint. Every platform buzzed with one question: had Jimmy Kimmel finally gone too far? The reactions were visceral. Some fans praised Kimmel's quick wit and joked that he had finally met his match, but others, in growing numbers, rallied behind Stallone, not just because of who he was, but because of what he had represented in that moment. Not ego, not outrage, but principle. On live television, Stallone had drawn a line in the sand between ridicule and respect, and it resonated. By the time Stallone stepped outside into the cool evening air of Los Angeles, the first reporters were already waiting near the studio gate. Cameras flashed. Microphones were shoved toward him. "What do you make of the reaction? Did you mean to call out late-night culture? Will you go back on the show?" He offered no sound bites, no headlines. Just a quiet nod and a few soft-spoken words. People are smart. They saw what they needed to see. Meanwhile, back inside, Jimmy Kimmel faced his own reckoning. The next guest was already in the wings, a young pop singer ready to perform, but the show had lost its rhythm. The jokes fell flat. The laughter felt forced. Kimmel's usual charm couldn't resurrect the room. During the final segment, Kimmel tried to salvage the evening. "Well, it's been an interesting night," he said, the corners of his mouth strained. "Sylvester Stallone gave us something a little different. I guess even Rocky throws a jab now and then." But it didn't land. There was no laughter, just a polite smattering of applause as the credits rolled. In the hours that followed, opinion pieces appeared. Headlines ranged from "Stallone dismantles," "Kimmel's mockery culture" to "Late-night TV faces a crisis of meaning." But the most shared headline came from a small independent columnist who captured the moment in just 7 words. The night Truth walked into a studio, and for Stallone, it wasn't about revenge or redemption. It was about restoring dignity in a space that had forgotten it. The television stage, once a beacon of storytelling and conversation, had become a place for quick laughs at the expense of depth. Stallone had, for just a few minutes, reminded the world what it looked like to speak from the heart, without flinching. But the story didn't end with the broadcast. The following morning, Stallone received a call from a network executive. Not for an apology, not for damage control, but for a proposal. They wanted to offer him something no one had expected. Not a guest slot, not a promotion. They wanted to give him his own show, one that was real, one that mattered. And in the span of 24 hours, what began? As a 5-minute interview turned into a movement, a public yearning for something honest, something rooted in respect, something that would not apologize for caring deeply. Stallone did not respond immediately. He had never chased cameras or craved platforms, but now he was holding something more powerful than either: the respect of a nation that was tired of laughing for the wrong reasons. And as the media storm swirled, Jimmy Kimmel sat in his office, re-watching the footage. Not once, but several times. Not to find the joke he missed, but to understand the moment he lost. Days passed, but the echo of that unforgettable night refused to fade. Across the country, debates ignited, on morning shows, podcasts, dinner tables, and in boardrooms. What began as an unscripted exchange between an aging action star and a late-night host had evolved into something much larger, something deeply cultural. Sylvester Stallone, long revered for his cinematic legacy, had become a symbol for those who felt the soul of public discourse had been hollowed out. Not by malice, but by mockery. Not by politics, but by apathy. And Jimmy Kimmel? He became the face of that very cynicism, though not by intention. He had built his empire on irony and punchlines, but the laughter had become brittle, and now, for the first time in his career, he was being forced to confront the cost of it. Behind closed doors at the network, discussions were growing tense. Ratings dipped in the days that followed. Fans who once flooded comment sections with laughter emojis now filled them with pointed questions. Why didn't you listen? Why did you try to embarrass him? What would you have done if the cameras were off? Public sentiment had begun to shift. The appetite for hollow applause and viral humiliation was waning. People wanted something else, something Stallone had delivered with ease, authenticity. And so the network's offer still stood. They envisioned a new kind of program, one where conversations had depth, one where guests were not props but people. A weekly show led by Stallone, rooted not in stunts or spectacle but in stories, real ones. The kind that made people remember who they were and what they cared about. But Stallone remained quiet. He wasn't hungry for attention. He had made his mark. This wasn't about career reinvention. It was about protecting something sacred. The power of truth told plainly. As he walked alone along the beach that weekend, wind sweeping through his hair, he thought not about the show or the fallout, but about the people watching from their living rooms, the ones who cheered not for the comeback of a character, but for the clarity of a man. He knew what he would say, if he accepted the offer. He wouldn't start with a monologue or a joke. He would look directly into the camera and ask what no one else dared to anymore. When did we stop listening to each other? When did we decide that sincerity was weakness? And what would it take to start again? But as he stood there, toes digging into the wet sand, another figure approached. It was not a producer, not a journalist, but Jimmy Kimmel. No cameras, no crew, just two men face to face again. Kimmel looked different now. Less guarded, more weathered. There was no rehearsed apology, no publicist-approved statement. Just a moment of honesty. "I watched it again," he said. "Not the clips, the whole thing. I get it now." Stallone said nothing at first. He simply nodded. "I forgot what the job was," Kimmel continued. "It's not to mock. It's to matter." For a long time, neither spoke. The waves did that. For them. Then Stallone broke the silence. People will forgive a bad joke. They won't forgive forgetting they matter. Kimmel breathed deep, the weight of the words settling in. "So what do I do now?" he asked, vulnerable. "You start by telling the truth," Stallone said, "even if it costs you something." And with that, he turned and walked back up the beach, leaving footprints in the sand. Faint, but unmistakable. Back in the city, networks buzzed, headlines spun, and millions waited to see what would happen next. But for the people who watched that night, the real story had already been told. It was not about celebrity or controversy. It was about the moment a man stepped into the spotlight and chose to speak with his soul instead of his ego. And in doing so, he reminded a nation that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it simply walks away after telling the truth. And that, more than anything else, is what left the audience speechless.